Good afternoon, and welcome back. Our next panel features the preeminent subject matter experts in the field of human trafficking. This group of speakers are the backbone of the U.S. government anti-trafficking program and are the architects of some of the largest human trafficking enforcement operations you've heard about over the years. Please join me in welcoming our next panel. This afternoon's Transnational Issues panel will be moderated by Assistant Attorney General Brian Benjakowski. Brian A. Benjakowski serves as the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. In that capacity, Mr. Benjakowski supervises the Criminal Division's more than 600 federal prosecutors who conduct investigations and prosecutions involving organized and transnational crime, gang violence, securities fraud, healthcare fraud, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, public corruption, cybercrime, intellectual property theft, money laundering, Bank Secrecy Act violations, child exploitation, international narcotics trafficking, human rights violations, and other crimes, as well as matters involving international affairs and sensitive law enforcement techniques. Mr. Benjakowski comes to the Criminal Division with over 10 years of public service in the federal government, having served in a variety of important leadership positions, both in the Department of Justice and on Capitol Hill, including as Chief of Staff for the Attorney General, Chief of Staff for the Deputy Attorney General, and the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Legislative Affairs. Prior to his confirmation, Mr. Benjakowski was a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of a large international law firm, where his practice focused on white-collar criminal defense, as well as government and internal investigations, including in the areas of healthcare fraud, environmental enforcement, and campaign finance. Please join me in welcoming what is sure to be an informative discussion, our Transnational Issues panel.
Thank you for that kind introduction and for all of you returning this afternoon for our Transnational Issues panel. Human trafficking, as I think we're learning, is a global problem that really knows no borders. As we heard earlier today, some cases are entirely domestic, but many are transnational in nature, which presents particular challenges. We see trafficked men, women, and children brought to the United States for forced labor or commercial sex. We also see U.S. persons traveling abroad to engage in child sex tourism. And we're, of course, working to confront all the complexities of prosecuting these crimes when they involve trans-border money flows and the use of the internet. These are horrific crimes that inflict grave harm and demand aggressive prosecution. Yet bringing perpetrators to justice can be all the more challenging given the transnational dimensions of the problem. Strong partnerships within the U.S. government and with our foreign counterparts have proven critical to confronting and dismantling transnational human trafficking enterprises. And today's panel reflects the broad spectrum of the United States government's efforts and entities that have been engaged in and focused on how we can more effectively bring these criminals to justice. We have an impressive lineup of panelists, true experts from the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of State. Our panelists will share how they've addressed the various challenges in investigating and prosecuting transnational human trafficking cases and ensuring that victims receive an appropriate measure of not only justice, but the support that they need. I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists in the order in which they're seated. Furthest to my right is Hillary Axsom. Hillary joined DOJ as a trial attorney in 2001, and for more than a decade has served as the director of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit in DOJ's Civil Rights Division. The HTPU prosecutes cases of national significance involving the sex trafficking of adults, international sex trafficking, and forced labor, and also provides policy expertise in these and other areas. And as its director, Hillary has developed and leads landmark interagency human trafficking enforcement initiatives. Next to her is Deb Connor, the chief of the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery section in DOJ's Criminal Division. MLARS, as it's known, leads the department's anti-money laundering and asset forfeiture enforcement efforts with a focus on complex, sensitive, multi-jurisdictional investigations. MLARS supports anti-human trafficking efforts across DOJ, including by helping prosecutors trace and seize assets of the criminal organizations behind trafficking activities. Deb joined MLARS as its principal deputy chief in 2015, and before that was a longtime prosecutor in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office for 16 years. Seated to my immediate left is Steve Grocke, the chief of the Child Exploitation and Obscenity section, also in DOJ's Criminal Division. Steve joined CIOS as a trial attorney more than 15 years ago and has served as its chief since 2015. CIOS and its High Technology Investigative Unit are the nation's experts in prosecuting federal child exploitation cases, including those involving online child exploitation, extraterritorial offenders, and of course, child sex trafficking. Steve also serves as the Chief Reserve Military Judge for the United States Air Force. Next to Steve is Tracy Raggs, the Unit Chief of the Human Trafficking Unit at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations here in Washington, D.C. Tracy has over 24 years of government service focused on dismantling transnational criminal organizations involved in human trafficking, human smuggling, child sexual exploitation, forced labor, money laundering, narcotics trafficking, and other violent crimes. Tracy is also a decorated veteran of the United States Marine Corps. Last and most certainly not least is Ambassador John Cotton Richmond, who serves as the ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, the highest position in the federal government dedicated to combating human trafficking. The ambassador leads the State Department's Anti-Trafficking Office, as well as the United States' global engagement to combat human trafficking, and coordinates our government's interagency efforts in this area. Prior to joining the State Department, Ambassador Richmond co-founded and led the Human Trafficking Institute, an NGO, and also served for a decade here at DOJ in the HTPU in the Civil Rights Division. Please join me in welcoming our five panelists here today. And given the limited time that we have here, I think we ought to just jump right in. Hillary, why don't you help us set the scene a little bit here? What does the crime of human trafficking look like? And can you describe a little bit what the types of human trafficking cases involving transnational organized crime that the HTPU has focused on?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Brian. Unfortunately, the threats posed by transnational organized criminal networks involving human trafficking are so wide-ranging and pervasive that it's actually hard to choose just one or two iterations of these threats to focus on. To give you a sense of how wide-ranging these threats are, victims are recruited from outside the US to be exploited for sex or for labor. From virtually every continent, Latin America, Eastern Europe, South Asia, East Asia. They can be smuggled across land borders without documents, or they can be flown in to airports with visas, whether legitimately obtained as guest workers or fraudulently obtained on false pretenses. Some of these transnational trafficking networks are highly structured organizations with business licenses and bank accounts, while others are loosely affiliated, family-based networks that are essentially off the grid and off the radar, not using formal financial institutions hardly at all. Some of these networks control their victims through brutal physical and sexual violence, while others use more subtle schemes of mounting debts, veiled threats, fear of reputational harm, shame of being duped, shame of returning home even more impoverished than you left. But despite these differences, there are certain common denominators. All of these transnational criminal enterprises recruit victims to use them as commodities, to exploit them within the United States. They're all using the promise of opportunity here in the United States to prey on some of the most vulnerable victims around the world. They're bringing them here, and they're using schemes of isolation, coercion, manipulation, intimidation, and fear to exploit them. What makes these networks particularly difficult to dismantle and interdict is that they're operating simultaneously within our borders to move the victims around and exploit them, and overseas to continue recruiting more victims and to maintain that fear that the networks can get back and harm the families. To give you an idea what this looks like, I'm just going to focus on two examples that we see over and over again. There are transnational sex trafficking networks operating out of the state of Tlaxcala, Mexico. It's one of the smallest, least populous, poorest states in Mexico with a very small population. Yet, castles, as they call them, rise from the otherwise bleak, dusty landscape, financed entirely by sex trafficking proceeds. These Tlaxcala trafficking networks, they go to the poorest parts of Mexico. They lure vulnerable victims with promises of love, marriage, and a better life. They bring them into the United States. They use threats of physical harm, control over the victim's children, threats against their families back home to compel them to perform dozens of acts of prostitution a day, 6 days a week, sometimes for years on end. And this can continue unabated unless and until we're able to detect the signs of these trafficking schemes and dismantle these networks. We did that recently by collaborating with Mexican anti-trafficking authorities and with Interpol to dismantle a notorious network that exploited dozens upon dozens of victims and compelled them into forced prostitution all up and down the eastern seaboard for over a decade until we were able to take down this operation by working simultaneously on both sides of the border. As this is going on, hundreds of victims being sex trafficked throughout the United States at any given moment, we're also seeing trans-Pacific trafficking networks recruiting young women from Thailand, China, Korea. There was recently a prosecution out of Minneapolis, United States Attorney McDonald's district, who moderated the last panel. Over 300 victims were identified and assisted, and that was just a snapshot of a network that operated for decades on end, operated in dozens of jurisdictions across the United States, promising a way out of poverty, but in reality, working the victims as essentially modern-day sex slaves, serving 10, 11, 12 customers a day, all the proceeds going to the criminal enterprise. And make no mistake, transnational enterprises do this for labor as well as for sex. We've seen Eastern European men and women recruited to serve on custodial commercial cleaning crews in the hospitality industry. We've seen Guatemalan men and boys recruited for agricultural processing, agricultural labor. All of these enterprises pose distinct challenges in that there's an attenuated chain of recruitment, deception, coercion, intimidation, and control. We have to be able to break this chain and detect the criminal conduct that's occurring both within the United States and thousands of miles away. To do this, we have to earn the trust of victims who are terrified of the traffickers' threats, who are distrustful of authorities. Throughout the morning, you heard about trauma-informed, victim-centered strategies, and these prove essential in combating transnational criminal networks. We also absolutely have to work through strong, multidisciplinary partnerships to take an all-crimes approach. We need the money laundering expertise, the visa fraud, the immigration expertise. We bring together many different authorities with differing kinds of expertise so we can simultaneously stabilize and protect the victims and follow the money and follow the illicit transportation and smuggling networks to really understand each link in this chain that transcends international borders. So that gives you a picture of what we're up against and of the steep climb we have ahead of us as we seek to disrupt and dismantle these networks.
Hillary, thank you for that. Steve, let's round out the picture a little bit here. What do extraterritorial cases involving child sex trafficking look like? And can you talk a little bit about successes we've had in this area and also some of the challenges that CIAS has faced on the child side?
Sure, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this panel. Thank you all for attending. It's an important issue. When it comes to our observations for child sex trafficking, I think that one of the things that has jumped out at me in our section over the past 15 years that I've been there is that we are often seeing US offenders who are transporting themselves overseas to certain locations where their monetary superiority, for lack of a better term, enables them to exploit children quite readily, quite easily, and they're effectively fueling a marketplace in that location for child sex trafficking. So you have places that I'm sure people in the audience can readily assume exist in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Cambodia, Thailand, but other parts of the world as well, parts of Latin America, parts of Eastern Europe, where there are marketplaces that exist that are more dedicated to commercial child sex involving children very overtly and very directly. And US citizens provide the customer base that fuels that, the dollars that basically not only results in the commercial exploitation of those children, but also the trafficking perhaps in that region. So in Thailand, for example, you may have certain cities or certain locations that are associated with sex tourism, child sex tourism. And in order to provide supply for the customers from the US and other parts of Western Europe or Canada or the UK, they need children to supply to them the services that they're seeking, these commercial sexual services, which are horrible. And so they're trafficking children from other parts of that region in Cambodia or Vietnam to satisfy that particular need. And so our section, in a different way than the way Hillary just described, gets involved in these transnational cases. And the reality that the US faced many years ago, in 2003 with the passage of the PROTECT Act, was that our criminal legal frameworks that we had to address these Americans that in some ways we were even exporting our own child sex offenders because of the registries that we have and the requirements on individuals in the United States. They don't like that, and they effectively take themselves to other parts of the world where you don't have that type of requirement, you don't have that type of capacity in those countries, and so we were exporting our own sex offenders. So to respond to that, laws were passed to try to extend the jurisdiction of the US over those particular offenders, recognizing the dire responsibility of the United States that we have to address a problem that's of our own making, that involves our own citizens, because the countries that they're traveling to don't have the capacity to investigate or prosecute those cases often. And oftentimes, the Americans are traveling back before the crimes are even identified. So now they're back in the United States. The evidence is sometimes in the United States as well as out of the country. And so they had to be addressed. And so over the years, and even very recently, we have focused efforts on targeting and prosecuting these individuals and holding them accountable for the horrific abuses that they commit involving children, sometimes extremely young, sometimes infants and toddlers that are abused overseas in these locations, and sometimes where the dire poverty that exists is fueling the access to those particular children. The issues that arise with respect to those particular types of offenses are incredibly complex and incredibly difficult to deal with, because nearly all the evidence that you need to prosecute the case and investigate the case exists in a foreign country. All of the witnesses are over there, all of the physical evidence is often there, the location, digital evidence can be there, investigators that actually investigated the case initially might be overseas. And so sometimes these cases involve bringing over to the United States upwards of 20 foreign witnesses. And in the case of many cases in Southeast Asia, for example, you might have the need for a half a dozen different interpreters. So it's not just one language that you're interpreting for a particular jury or a judge to present your case. You're dealing with many different dialects, many different unusual circumstances. So that presents pretty significant issues. Sometimes we lack treaties for legal assistance or for extradition if the offender is arrested in that foreign country. And it can create a delicate balance with that foreign government to try to ensure a just result as to who's going to take responsibility and prosecute that particular case. So those types of cases, certainly in my experience, are some of the most complex that I've ever prosecuted because of those particular factors and because the U.S. Sort of monetary issues that exist. You also have issues where witnesses can very easily be paid a monetary compensation, so there's a lot of obstruction of justice. So a host of different issues that arise in those particular cases that create a lot of complexity. I want to touch just for a minute as well on another sort of more recent phenomenon that has arisen that's fueled by technology and the U.S. customers that are out there, which we recognize is certainly part of any child sex trafficking or any sex trafficking or trafficking scheme, right? You have a supply side and you have a demand side, which includes customers, and the U.S. citizens are those customers. And that's in this area of what we call frequently virtual child sex trafficking or virtual child sex tourism, where the children are actually living overseas. They maintain a presence overseas. They're not physically transported to the United States, but through live feed, so webcamming technology that exists very easily and readily at all of our fingertips. Everybody in this room has a cell phone. All of those mobile phones, those smartphones, have that capability to connect with individuals thousands of miles away where they have at their disposal children that they can put on camera on demand and perform sexual performances essentially, or sexual acts on demand for an American customer who's sitting comfortably in their own home and paying somewhere between $15 and $30. So that is obviously fueling not only that commercial sex marketplace, but also in connection with that, you have children being trafficked from outer islands, outer areas within the Philippines, for example, or other countries to provide that supply, to come to those what are commonly referred to as cyber sex dens to engage in that conduct. And that is another area that our section is focused on in bringing cases against the U.S. citizens here who are committing those offenses and are fueling that particular marketplace and activity and trafficking. But also working with our foreign partners to try to bring evidence and knowledge base to foreign governments so that they can adequately deal and investigate and prosecute the individuals that are providing the supply side. So just very quickly, those are two key areas that my section's been heavily involved in, as I mentioned, since I've been there, but still massive problems in a variety of different places around the world where child sex trafficking really crops up and is dominant in that marketplace.
Thanks, Steve. Deb, both Hillary and Steve have referenced the financial and economic component to these crimes. Why are financial investigations important to transnational human trafficking prosecutions? And are there ways that we can leverage existing data from financial institutions or elsewhere to enhance our investigations? And is there a marker or progress or a key challenge that you can share with us that shows us that we are making progress in this area?
Yes to all of it. Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for having me here. The human trafficking, sex trafficking market, forced labor market, generates $150 billion in proceeds and profits for traffickers all over the world. Some studies report that it is the most profitable international crime behind drug trafficking. So it is the money that motivates all around the world. It is also the money construct, this framework of money that it takes to move the people and the property around the world for the purposes of making these profits. And so the financial investigation is so important because outside of the facts that have been described here about the cases, behind the scenes, there's an entire sphere of financial dynamics going on to make all of this happen and get the proceeds back to the individuals who continue to promote this criminal activity. And by looking at that and examining it, and it's not easy, it takes investigators, many of whom are in this room, to unpack these financial transactions. But I generally proceed on the D's and the P's. So in the D's, we're looking to deter the activity by dismantling these networks, disrupting the financial flows, and depriving them of their profits, which means when we get these investigations, looking at how money is moving. And it can be as small as what's happening on very small credit card transactions, to cash transactions inside a bank, to large transactions and wires coming inside and outside the country. And what can happen is that banks can identify what we call typologies, behavior of money moving, and see that as looking like either something in the exploitation lane or the transportation lane of either of these two kinds of crimes. And we can find out and ferret out that it is happening even if we can't get the victims to the table right away. But we can then start to marry up these regions of the world and the country with this financial activity. And when we do that, we're looking for what I call the P's, our proceeds, our people, and our property. We want to look for the proceeds of crime because under the very basic money laundering statute, 18 U.S.C. 1956, it criminalizes knowingly engaging in a financial transaction with the proceeds of a specified unlawful activity, of which all of these trafficking crimes are. So if you are engaging in moving money in the United States or around the world to conceal or hide an activity, to promote it, meaning you are paying for victims to come back and forth, to evade your tax reporting requirements or your banking reporting requirements, we can charge you, provided we can prove that with a money laundering crime. And to do that, I don't have to ask a victim who has been terribly traumatized by what's happened to them either in sex trafficking, human trafficking, or labor. I can use my IRS agents, my HSI agents, my financial analysts to talk about bank documents and the movement of money. Those things that don't lie, that can't be intimidated, that haven't been abused. And I can build a construct around this activity. And the reason why is because then I find people. I can find defendants, co-defendants, cooperators, other victims to build out this network. I can also find individuals in banks, at financial institutions, in credit card agencies who are not part of the crime, but who are going to testify about how all this activity is unusual and how it fits into the patterns that have been discussed here. And then when I do that, I'm going to look for property because I can seize it with some of my forfeiture authorities that come at the end of this money laundering. I can seize facilitating property, homes, cars, businesses, hotels, restaurants. We can seize overseas bank accounts. We can freeze them. We can hold the money in place to keep it from moving through the system again. And this property, once seized, if lawfully forfeited, can be given back to victims of these crimes, can be used in law enforcement to continue to investigate this activity. Now, money laundering is not always the most glamorous of endeavors that you might go down. It is a painstaking, tedious process of chasing one financial transaction after the other. But if you understand the construct, if you know what the typologies are for this activity, it can be a really exciting part of the process. And in these cases, we had the good fortune to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Minnesota on the Thai trafficking case. In fact, one of my former prosecutors from D.C. was one of the lead prosecutors in that case. And in that case, we traced $25 million of criminal proceeds going out of the United States and coming back into the United States from Thailand. We were able to secure $1.5 million in restitution for one of the victims, and we're continuing to pursue other forms of forfeited property and assets so that we can use this to also add more restitution to the victims of these cases. So it is critical, though, that these financial investigations begin as early as possible in the investigation, because we can work alongside our subject matter experts in the SUA, the underlying crime, and we may be able to point them in directions to broaden the network, to locate individuals overseas. And even if we can't get these individuals overseas, we can stop, trap, seize money flows, and hopefully that deters or cut off the source of supply for the continuation of this activity. So we have had the good fortune of being able to work very closely with a lot of our partners, both in law enforcement and in U.S. attorneys' offices, to add what I call the force multiplier of these money laundering investigations. Some of the key things that are being expanded upon, we have a lot of these, as Steve said, online advertising websites. They're now taking their business overseas. We're having banks and those agencies use shell companies to try to hide their operations. So we use a lot of this financial tracing to help locate those entities as well and try to identify who's behind that. So more sophisticated criminals using shell companies and trying to push their ownership away from this activity.
Thanks, Deb. I think it's fair to say if we don't attack the financial component to this and strangle the criminal proceeds and the money, that we just continue to fight this problem. I think the money side of it is critically important. Tracy, now we've heard from prosecutors. We want to understand from an investigative agency's perspective how these cases look, including the capacity that you have to investigate transnational human trafficking cases and the opportunities that you see and the challenges that you face at the investigative level.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. And I'm always excited to talk about human trafficking when I'm talking to partners. And that's why I look at each one of you as being one of our partners, potential partners if you're not a partner now. You know, HSI, Homeland Security as a whole, HSI has over 6,000 agents worldwide. We have over 200 domestic offices in the United States, 80 foreign offices in 53 countries. That's important because of the fact that we're able to reach out to our partners when we need help. As you heard Hillary speak about, and also Steve, about things that are happening overseas. HSI has a unique authority to handle anything that's coming in and out of the United States. That was one of our authorities as well as when we were Customs before we became HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. And in those countries, we have vetted units that we work with. These are individuals that we have vetted, we have trained on how to do our investigations to assist us when we're having issues overseas or our traffickers is going back overseas or our victims overseas to help us locate them and bring them to justice. HSI participates in over 100 task forces here in the United States. That's very important because we alone, I said we have 6,000 agents worldwide, we alone cannot combat this by ourselves. So we look upon our partners to help us when we're doing this. This has been one of the priorities for HSI as a whole, but our department now, Department of Homeland Security, has really taken this on and which has over 22 different agencies. They have taken this on and created a new strategy for human trafficking, child exploitation, and goods importing using forced labor. This is going to be a department-wide thing. So that means that all 22 of those agencies will give their resources to fight and combat human trafficking. We were doing it individually, but now we're coming together as a department, which is going to give us more leverage to go after these traffickers. So that's a big thing for HSI. In 2019, what we were able to create over 1,000 criminal investigations, which culminated into over 2,100 arrests for human trafficking, which we got 690 convictions. But more importantly of all that, we were able to identify, rescue, and stabilize over 428 victims. And that's what I take from this each and every time I do this. It's every victim that we're able to help and stabilize. That's where I feel that we've accomplished something and did something. I know there's a lot more, but there is one less out there when we do our jobs and when we come together as a partnership to make this happen. You know, you talk about the opportunities. I think HSI, again, we are unique in the sense that we have different authorities. We have over 400 laws that we can enforce, but we have the immigration authority as well as customs authority. And why that's important is because traffickers do not operate in a silo. They don't just do human trafficking. You know, they're involved in drug trafficking, they're involved in weapons trafficking, they're involved in human smuggling, they're involved in gang activity, as well as forced labor in the supply chain. When we have victims that are not ready to cooperate, we're able to use those other authorities to go after those traffickers. I've told all of my guys since I've taken over this unit that we will get that trafficker. If he's trafficking, we're going to get him. We will find one of those violations of law. We have over 400 that we can use, and we use those, and we have great agents out in the field that are thinking outside of the box. And for this type of crime, we have to think outside the box. One of the things that I failed to mention in our capacity, we have our victim assistance specialists and our forensic interview specialists that we have brought on. This past year, we were able to get 30 forensic interview specialists. And that's very important. It doesn't sound like a lot, but just think we only had 6 before that. Now we have 30. So that helps our victims. When the victims do not identify as victims, that helps us to send them in to do the interviews. They're not talking to law enforcement. They're talking to someone that can understand and really help them and give them things they need. It was mentioned earlier about the traffickers. The traffickers always tell you, hey, I'm the only one that loves you. Nobody's going to love you. Nobody's going to take care of you. And this was mentioned earlier, if we don't fulfill those needs that they have, they're going to go back to doing what they know to do, because that's how they survive. It becomes a survival thing. It's not that they want to do it, and I heard from some very good speakers today, victims, rescuers, survivors, that really drove home that point that we have to do more to help them in doing this. So the thing that I look at here is that when we look at the challenges that we come across, and we come across as law enforcement, we have a lot of challenges that we have to overcome. Because first of all, we come upon a victim. The victim doesn't identify initially as a victim. They won't have anything to do with law enforcement, especially Homeland Security investigations. Because if they're an undocumented victim, the trafficker's already told them they're going to be deported, you're going to go to jail, and all these things here. That is not the case. We will work with our victims. We're not looking to lock up victims. We're working with our victims to give them the resources they need. So we work very closely with our victim assistance specialists as well as our NGOs. They have been great partners to us to help stabilize those victims so they get the assistance they need and that they deserve. And that's what our victim assistance specialists do. They inform them about the law, the different entitlements they are entitled to under the law for to be stabilized, and the resources that's out there. And again, our non-government organizations, our NGOs, are there as partners with us to provide those things that we cannot provide. One of the things here, because I made these little notes for myself so I make sure I hit them all, is the global footprint that we have. That affords us the ability to go after traffickers when they think they can go back home. Hillary and I have been working a case that we got conviction on out of Mexico. She talked about a little bit about bilateral. We brought back 5 traffickers, and they were prosecuted here in the United States. They all went to prison. We got sentenced from 8 to 25 years on those individuals. We were able to rescue over 12 ladies in this part of it. Now, this organization has families. So you do one part of a family, then you have another family. So this part here, there's the Rendon Reyes case. It was 12 individuals. 2 of those were minors that we were able to rescue. But more importantly, back home in Mexico, we were able to rescue the daughter of one of the victims. That's how the trafficker was holding her hostage. But I'm going to do something to your daughter. When we had that takedown, we were able to rescue that daughter and let her know your daughter's okay, which gave her relief. You know, we look to empower our victims when we do that. Again, the challenges that we face is that the training, awareness, getting people to understand that is not what it used to be when we saw a person out there on the corner. We said, this is a prostitute. They want to do that. That's them. It doesn't do that. That's different. We have to change that mindset, and that's what we're doing when we do our trainings, when we have these conversations about human trafficking. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to educate people what human trafficking is. As one of the survivors said today, they don't want to be out there, but that's what they know. They brought it from little kids doing this, most of them, or they were tricked by their boyfriend to get into this lifestyle. So that's a challenge that we have to overcome to get them the assistance they need in doing that. You know, I gave you the stats of what HSI has done on the criminal side, but I'd like to talk to you or tell you a little bit about what our victim assistance specialists have done. In FY19, our victim assistance specialists supported approximately 2,667 victims nationwide. This includes victims of various types of crimes, because we do more than just human trafficking. We got child exploitation. You know, if you're involved in a crime dealing with narcotics, those are victims that our VAS come together to support. And as I told you, we just got more VAS on. We only have about 35 total for all, for the nationwide. So that's a lot of work for those individuals, 35 individuals, and we just got them on. Before that, we had about, I think, around 22 or so. One other thing before my time is running out is a forensic interview specialist. They conducted over 1,150 interviews, both domestically and internationally. That's very important because agents, we know how to interview, but we're looking for that criminal. And sometimes we're not as gentle as we should be because we want you to give us the answer, and sometimes our victims are not ready to do that. They're going to tell us stories that are not true, or they're going to tell us a story that they think will get them out of something and not really get their trafficker in too much trouble, and that just frustrates agents. So that's where the training comes in, that we have to train them. So we have our forensic interview specialists that come in that are trained to do this. They're ready to talk to them and to help them understand that we're here to help them. So thank you for letting me come here and speak to you about what we do. We do a lot more, but I only have a certain amount of time, so I want to respect that time as much as possible. Thank you.
Tracy, thank you for that. Ambassador Richmond, I've had a chance to hear from law enforcement about at the sort of prosecutorial and investigative level, but some of the most important work that the U.S. government does, it does through the State Department at the global level, and working with our international partners, working with NGOs. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the transnational trends that you're seeing at the State Department and how those trends can help investigators, law enforcement, NGOs, and others develop best practices so that we can improve upon the work that we're doing and the support that we're providing to victims?
Absolutely. First of all, let me just say, it's good to be back at the Department of Justice. As I look out, I see a lot of friends who I know have labored for a long time to bring care to victims and to stop traffickers. And so as you celebrate the DOJ's great work in the last 20 years, it's a privilege to join you. It was 2 decades ago that Congress gave you these new laws, passed the comprehensive anti-trafficking statute in 2000, and those new laws were untested. They obviously had not been used before. They were filled with words that courts had never interpreted, like serious harm and coercion and venture. And you all had the hard work of taking those first few Section 1589 forced labor cases, taking those first few Section 1591 sex trafficking cases, and making them into a reality to actually help people. Bureaucracies are not known for embracing change, and you all had to take that on, and you have a lot to be proud of. During that time, you also developed a lot of best practices, and those are best practices that I get to talk to other countries about as we go out and advance U.S. foreign policy around this issue of freedom, of making sure that everyone gets to be free, reminding them that each individual has inherent value and human dignity. There are a number of international trends, particularly when we're thinking about trafficking as a transnational crime. I would love to focus on a number of them. There's state-sanctioned forced labor. There's been changes around the child soldier issue. There's a deep concern about individuals from Africa and Asia being trafficked into the Gulf region to work as domestic workers. There's a number of different categories, but if I could focus in on a couple this afternoon, I think I'd pick the fact that there are very few traffickers held accountable around the world. There are, in almost every country that we get to visit, there are low rates of investigation and prosecution. We've seen since 2015 a 42% decrease around the globe of traffickers held accountable. It's a very concerning fact. It's not equally true everywhere. In Europe, we've seen a 55% drop in prosecutions. Central Asia, a 52% drop. We know there's been a decrease in investigations even right here in the United States. As we engage around that trend, we look to a best practice that you all developed here at the Department of Justice and get to share that with them as part of our diplomacy. One of those trends is the creation of specialized units. You've done it with Steve's unit, the Child Exploitation Obscenity Unit, with Hillary's team, with Innocence Lost, with ACT teams, with federal enforcement working groups. You have modeled for the world how you could take individuals and instead of making trafficking an additional task on their very full docket, trying to add it in and fit trafficking in as a collateral duty, you've made it their primary task. And when that happens, we know that more victims will be identified and more cases will get done. So we're able to share that example as a best practice and encourage governments around the world to establish specialized units, whether it could be a specialized forced labor investigative unit or whether it's a prosecution unit. We know that specialization is a proven practice that works. Another trend that we see is a great amount of difficulty, I think, for individuals to understand how victims experience the criminal justice system, to understand the effects of trauma and how that might impact an individual as a case does go forward. One of the best practices that you've developed, and Tracy was talking about it, is having victim witness specialists. We get to share the stories of how you all have developed these victim witness programs, how you've embedded them in U.S. attorneys' offices, in investigative units, individuals who are not there to find out the facts about the case, but to make sure that the victim understands what's going on, is connected to the right services, understands what might come next, even as cases get continued, or why additional interviews or conversations might be had. A best practice that you all have developed that we're able to share. Another recurring challenge we see globally is what options governments have when they have a victim who doesn't have authorization to be in the country where they're found. And what are their legal options? We lift up the Trafficking Victims Protection Act's creation of continued presence immigration status and the T visa as a model, as a useful tool that you all have championed and used over and over again to benefit your cases, but also to benefit the survivors. You understand that stabilizing a survivor is going to benefit everyone, well, everyone except the trafficker. Because if a victim is stabilized, they're more likely to get services, they're more likely to participate in the investigation and in the prosecution. Of course, we've seen a slight decrease in the use of continued presence and the T visa. We hope that that trend will shift as well. We also share our challenges. We share our own struggles with them and try to learn best practices from other countries. We try to be open and frank as we do that. We know that if we're all in this common battle together, particularly with transnational cases. As we shift now into looking ahead instead of behind, we think about what we've accomplished over the last 20 years. We think about what is ahead. What should we focus on? And I think that the field around trafficking needs to continue to mature. We need to continue to develop these proven practices, make sure we scale them, make sure we measure well, that we think critically about what interventions are working and which ones are not. We need to come alongside countries and encourage them to do better, to make sure that they're investing in all 3 Ps of this 3P paradigm: prosecution, protection, and prevention. Right now, we know that trafficking is a low-risk, high-reward crime, and traffickers operate with impunity. If we're going to be successful as we move into the future, we're going to have to reverse that. We're also going to have to flip the script on the traffickers who consistently tell victims that they are worthless, that they don't matter, and that no one will listen to them. We need to make sure that we flip that script by reminding them that they do matter, by showing up and doing our work and engaging them as individuals. We need to make sure that we listen to them and we hear their voices. You had survivors speak today, which is great. We have the U.S. Advisory Council that advises the President and the interagency about their perspective on our work, whether they're critical or encouraging. We need to hear their voices, and you all have led in that work. As we move ahead, the administration has just announced in a proclamation over the weekend that they want to declare freedom first, that we want to bring up this issue of freedom as the first part of our conversation when we engage. We want to make sure that people understand that until someone is free from their trafficker, they don't get to exercise their other freedoms. They don't get to assemble wherever they want or worship where they want or say what they want to say. We need to make sure that we prioritize freedom in all of our work and our conversations as we go forward. So on behalf of the Department of State, I just want to thank the Department of Justice for providing these best practices, these examples, as we try to share America's experience and encourage the world to all move towards freedom together.
Ambassador, thank you for that. And I should have said at the outset of your presentation, it's great to have someone in that role at the State Department who has been in the trenches here at the Justice Department with investigators and prosecutors, knows these issues firsthand and brings your level of passion and expertise to the world on behalf of the United States. So thank you for that. We have a few minutes left. I thought I would do a few follow-ups, but Hillary, you talked at the outset about some strategies and kind of what we see as as a repeat matter in these cases. Is there anything you can tell us if I ask you to sort of put your crystal ball on the table a little bit? What's the next frontier? How are we getting ahead of what the next frontier is in these issues? And what can we share with the audience about what we see kind of coming around the corners in the area of human trafficking?
Thanks, Brian. As everyone has referenced, trafficking is a hidden crime because the victims are terrified into silence. So we have to be proactive about detecting these crimes, and we're learning the hard way that we're trying to put together a criminal case against transnational trafficking networks with more than half of the evidence located overseas and accessible only to foreign law enforcement counterparts, if accessible at all. We have to build these direct strategic enforcement partnerships with foreign law enforcement. Otherwise, we're trying to put together a puzzle with half of the pieces not present in the box, just lost forever. We've been doing that with Mexico. We have a long way to go, and we need to do it with other countries that pose significant threats of trafficking victims into the U.S. We're also working through the Interpol Human Trafficking Experts Group. This year, the United States has stepped up to chair that group, and we're really doing some cutting-edge work leveraging the data and intel that's available from the NGO, the non-governmental organizations who are very committed to anti-trafficking work, and from the private sector partners, whether it's technology, telecommunications, financial sector, transit. There is valuable data located outside the reach of law enforcement, and there are legal restrictions and challenges to access, but by cross-training and dialogue, we can train private sector partners to detect indicators and report them, and we as law enforcement can learn from private sector partners what they can preserve, capture, and analyze that will help us strengthen our detection capacity and our cases. So I think that's a really promising frontier, those kinds of partnerships we're building through the Interpol Human Trafficking Experts Group.
Thank you. Good stuff. Steve, Hillary talked about this. Ambassador Richmond mentioned it too. We rely so heavily on foreign in this the world seems to be shrinking every day, but the challenges that we face in this area just are compounded by the fact that there are just far corners of the globe where this conduct occurs. And so we rely heavily on foreign governments' response and capacity, particularly often in the developing world, where the law enforcement challenges generally are so much greater. Are there things that CIAS has done to try to help build that capacity in those parts of the world, in keeping with what also Hillary has mentioned here?
Yes, actually, it's a great intersection of what Ambassador Richmond was talking about and what Hillary was talking about. Her own section is working on in Mexico. One of the focuses of our section we kind of recognized pretty early on in both prosecuting some of these Americans that were traveling abroad, but also through that process seeing the types of child sex trafficking marketplaces that existed in those countries, that we needed capacity in that country to both help enable us to prosecute back home, because they're going to be the ones that are involved in if there's computer evidence, conducting forensic examination, potentially seizing evidence, investigating early parts of the cases, but also potentially prosecuting their own participants that may be connected to the Americans. So there's another piece there that we recognize that prosecuting the customer back home wasn't going to solve that particular problem, that you had other countries that perhaps had citizens going there. And so the individuals that are running child sex brothels, for lack of a better term, but just putting children out on the street, very openly and notoriously in those places, that they also had to be dealt with. And so we focused on trying to build a systemic response, a systemic approach to that particular training. The State Department has programs called Child Protection Compacts that we've consulted with and also actively participated in trying to bring that training to life. So they provide funding, working with NGOs in the Philippines, for example, through the International Justice Mission. And we provide prosecutors and computer forensic specialists and work with investigators as well as victim specialists to try to bring those best practices to those countries and build a real system of response. I think, as Ambassador Richmond mentioned, we've learned, over 20 years from our own failures in some of these areas, and having the appropriate victim-centered response and focusing on survivors and their needs, as people have mentioned today, is critical to that success. And having different experts, if you will, that everybody has mentioned, is critical to having an effective response. So we want to be able to deliver that model to all corners of the globe as best we possibly can with the limited resources that everybody has, so that we know that having capacity in all spaces of the world that kind of is raising the tide will lift all boats and will ultimately turn the tide on this particular problem.
Thank you. I hope you all realize or recognize the tremendous amount of expertise on this stage today, but also I think a lot of passion for this issue, and I hope that passion came through. Some of these discussions can often sound legal and technical, but I do hope, and I certainly take away from this group not only that they are legally and operationally committed to helping solve this problem, but that they really have kind of the fire in each of their bellies for this. And for that, it's always a tremendous honor to be able to work with people who dedicate themselves to solving these kinds of problems. So please join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you for taking the time to hear us today.